Welcome back to another episode of the MMA Lockcast. I'm your host, Manpreet, aka MMA Lock of the Night, your boy on social media at MMALOTN, and the architect behind the MMA Fight Archive, ensuring you leave no stone unturned when you're researching these upcoming MMA events. This weekend, we only have ACA and UFC going down, but next weekend, there's also Cage Warriors, KSW, LFA, OKTAGON, PFL Europe, Risen 47, Fury FC, and also the UFC. We'll have direct links to past fights for all of the fighters on those cards, and not to mention a total of 17 promotions that we cover from all over the world. So it is your one-stop shop to ensure you have everything you need to study up on these cards, whether you're making predictions, bets, game planning, as we do have coaches and fighters on the service as well, commentators, gamblers, analysts, handicappers, all of that. They're all on this MMA Fight Archive, so they can give you the most information and accurate information as possible, because I am the best in the world in terms of finding fight footage on all these competitors, and that's why I have over 3,700 fighter profiles for you to check out from, choose from, and see whichever fighter it is, whether they have a fight coming up or not. We have profiles available at all times, so you can research any fighter that you choose to research. 7-day free trial. Check out the link in the description below to try it out and enjoy. All right, this week, the UFC is finally back after taking a weekend off, but they return with a pay-per-view card going down in Newark, New Jersey. UFC 302, headlined by a lightweight title fight between Islam Makhachev, looking to defend his title, I believe, for the third time now. Twice he's already done it against Alexander Volkanovski, and now he's looking to defend it against Dustin Poirier, who's only coming off of one win over Benoit Saint-Denis, but considering how the lightweight division is shaking out right now, and the clear number one contender being Arman Tsarukyan, not wanting to take as quick of a turnaround here as he just fought at UFC 300. The only next person up would have been Dustin Poirier. He has name value. People would want to see him fight for the title again, so why not throw him in there? The co-main event sees a 5-round middleweight title fight, or middleweight fight, I should say, between former champion Sean Strickland going up against Bohatinha Paulo Costa. Like I said, 5-rounder there. Very fun fight. A lot of good fights sprinkled out throughout this UFC 302 card. Obviously, I'll be breaking it down for you guys in full here. And as I mentioned on the last episode of the MMA Lockcast, I won't be doing full recaps anymore, just so I can speed through these intros a little bit quicker and get to these breakdowns for you guys. But I will quickly touch on the lock of the night and dog of the night plays of the last UFC card. The last one, obviously, we cashed with Melissa Gatto. That now brings our record to 36-19 on the year for a 65% hit rate. Again, got to get closer to that 75% that we were at last year, and hopefully end closer to 80% by the ending of the year. We went 5-0 on lock of the night plays over the, since I've done the last podcast, and including the regional shows that I covered as well. And then on the flip side, dog of the night, reverse swept. We went 0-5, and now that brings our record for dog of the night plays to 18-37 on the year for a 33% hit rate. Again, I go more in depth on those statistics, hit rates, profit, loss, whatever, all that stuff for the lock of the night and dog of the night plays on the top 3 lock of the night, top 3 dog of the night segments, which will be coming out on Tuesday and Wednesdays respectively. So make sure you guys keep your eyes out for that. And then also, if you are looking for the Locky 2-step / Locky Trinity parlay that I normally drop to the public for free on Fridays, I drop it to the Patreon folks on Monday evenings more often than not, so they're able to lock in a better price compared to the price that the public ends up getting on Fridays. We've been on a bit of a heater with those parlays as well, so if you want to hop in on that, check out the Lock of the Night Patreon page, link for that in the description below. And then the last thing I want to plug here real quick, one more thing about the Lock of the Night Patreon. ACA 176 goes down this week, and I'll be doing written breakdowns for every single one of those fights. It goes down the day before the UFC, so if you want to get some early action before we get to the pay-per-view card, you guys can see the written breakdowns and track plays I'll be having for that card on the Lock of the Night Patreon page. Again, link in the description below. And lastly, shout out to the guys over there at GodzillaWins.com, providing your boy a platform to drop written articles for the public. On Thursdays, we drop the main event breakdowns. And then on Friday, we drop the top 3 Moneyline spots. So if you want to check those out, go to GodzillaWins.com. And if it is Thursday or Friday, you'll be able to find my content up there on the MMA page. Make sure you check them out for all the other team sports as well, as they got you covered for all of that good stuff as well. All right, first fight of the night goes down between Andre Lima and short notice UFC debutant Mitch Raposo, who comes in at plus 185, minus 220 on the Brazilian. The undefeated Brazilian, who comes in with an 8-0 record and is coming off about 2 months ago that bite of the night bonus that he received from Dana White, as his opponent Igor Severino, I believe his name was, ended up biting him in the second round, leaving a good chunk of a mark there on the, I think it was left or right bicep, the inner bicep. And he ended up getting it tattooed that night. Probably one of the weirder and dumber decisions in my opinion, but he did end up getting a bonus for it from Dana White, as I think he threw him up about like 20 grand or something like that for getting it tattooed. Absolutely weird circumstances, but it is what it is. Lima comes from a kickboxing and Muay Thai background, and you can see that on display whenever he gets into his groove and he's able to go out there and dictate the pace. Throws with a lot of power, a lot of speed, and good precision, although he's a little bit lacking in terms of the volume that he's throwing out there. And I think a lot of that has to do with him trying to manage his gas tank. I do believe that he does have a bit of a cardio issue that can be exposed by fighters that are not deterred by his striking advantage and are able to go out there and put on a bit of a pace on him. And I expected his last opponent, Igor Severino, to do just that. And Severino did manage to land some takedowns in the first, was landing takedowns in the second. And I thought he was slowly starting to take over. And even with Lima slowly working his way back to his feet every single time, I thought that resistance was going to start to dwindle the longer that fight ended up going. Even though he comes from a kickboxing and Muay Thai background, he does showcase some good grappling qualities as well, as we've seen him throw up submissions off of his back, look for reversals and look for get-ups. But I think more of that is for show rather than actual substance, and I don't know if he'll be able to pull off submissions against some of the UFC level competition he'll be going up against here. I have a lot of question marks about Lima, but he cannot be denied in terms of being a very strong, powerful striker that deserves a lot of respect. Now his opponent this weekend, Mitch Raposo, has gotten a couple opportunities to try to make it to the UFC, the first of which was TUF 29, where he was actually the first overall pick, I believe, for Team Volkanovski, but he ended up coming up short in his first matchup against Ludovic Sholinian, who was able to push the pace a little bit more on him and was able to grind that fight out and win it on a 2-round decision. His next opportunity was on the Contender series as he took on Jake Hadley. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that was a bit of a short notice spot, but regardless, he ended up taking the fight and he ended up getting submitted in the second round. Now, I think Raposo is much better than those two fights indicate to us. He did manage to go on a 4-fight winning streak on the regional scene, which propped him up for this UFC short notice spot. And he does come from a wrestling background, as you saw in some of these fights, where he's able to take opponents to the ground and do some good damage from on top. But one thing is clear as of late, especially in his recent performances, that he's working on his striking and he's working on his hands. His last 3 wins have come by knockout, and I'm not saying he's going to go out there and knock out a guy like Andre Lima, but it should give him a little bit of confidence in terms of not rushing the rest of his game, as he can go out there and try to be competitive in the striking realm. He's developed a bit of a calf kicking game, which could potentially help him here, but I think it's going to be his pace, his pressure, and his wrestling which will ultimately catch up to Andre Lima. I think Raposo will not be defeated before he comes into the cage here, as most of Lima's opponents have been in the past. And I think we'll see Raposo put on a good pace, good pressure, showcase that he has the better cardio as well, and just mix in the wrestling, even if it means taking him down 6, 7, 8 times, even if Lima continues to work back to his feet. I think it's going to get harder and harder for Lima to do so as we get into deeper water, and I think Raposo has the better gas tank over 15 minutes. I think he has the better ability to apply his pressure, and I think he should be able to stay away from the big power of Lima and then put him through that grind and win this fight just off control time and hopefully some damage as well. So I like him as an underdog to kick off the card here at plus 185, getting a win in his UFC debut. All right, next up, we got bantamweights going at it, women's bantamweights, as we have a grudge match here between minus 195 Eileen Perez as she goes up against the plus 170 Jocelyn Edwards. Now, both these women were entrenched a little bit of beef a couple months back now, where they, I believe, crossed paths at the Apex or even at Extreme Couture. I don't remember which one, but it was in Vegas somewhere, and they got into a scuffle. That's what caused Eileen Perez to have a black eye going into the fight that she had against Lucy Podolova. Very weird and unfortunate circumstance there. But now they finally get to duke it out in the cage and hopefully settle their beef at that point. We'll start off on the Eileen Perez side, who's riding a 2-fight winning streak. Both fights where she dominated both of her opponents, accruing over 20 minutes of control time in the 30 minutes she spent in the cage in those 2 fights. She did start to slow down in the second fight against Lucy Podolova in the third round, but luckily she was able to hold on enough to not get 10-8'd and have that fight go to a draw. She clearly needs to work on her striking a little bit, but she's so strong and powerful when she gets a hold of her opponents that she's able to drag them to the ground and then just have solid control and success from that top position. You see when opponents have a clearer and much better grappling game and jiu-jitsu game than her, that they're able to kind of just have her way with her, just as Stephanie Egger showed her in her UFC debut back in 2022. But for the most part, Perez does a great job in terms of establishing her top position, being very heavy from that top position and just grinding on her opponents. She looks to eventually get to dominant positions to try to rain down big shots, but I think she's done a great job in terms of managing her gas tank so she can go out there and at least secure 2 rounds before going out there and eventually winning fights on the scorecards. Her opponent this weekend, Jocelyn Edwards, comes in off of a loss to Nora Cornol in a fight that arguably could have gone her way, but that ultimately snapped a 3-fight winning streak that she had, where she was able to get decision victories over Ramona Pascual, Ji Yoon Kim, and Lucy Podolova. A few of those questionable decisions, so maybe it was just karma in terms of her losing that Cornol fight. Edwards sometimes has a solid volume-based game where she's able to kick her opponents from distance and stay on her bicycle and not eat too much damage in return. And she's also shown decent takedowns in her game as well, where she's been able to control opponents from that top position or even throw up some submissions off of her back. But she can be grounded and she can be nullified, just as we saw from Jessica Rose Clark in the past, and even the opponent before that, I believe it was Carol Hosa. But again, grudge match here. Curious to see if it's going to cause any of these fighters to fight unlike themselves, but I do think that we'll see the fighter who wants to win showcase a more disciplined game, and I actually think that we're going to see it from the Perez side here. I think we'll see her exploit the takedown defense issue in Jocelyn Edwards' game, and that will allow Perez to just grind her up from that top position. I don't think Edwards is clean enough or threatening enough, especially late in fights, to take advantage of Perez's poor gas tank, especially late in fights, which I think will allow Perez to just stay safe enough. And as long as she doesn't get caught in any submissions, which is a threat early on in this matchup, but if Perez can fend off those submission attempts within the first couple minutes, she should be able to grind out the rest of this fight, as, again, Edwards has piss poor takedown defense. She doesn't do the best in terms of controlling herself, just as we saw in the Cornol fight where she was getting reversed at the ending of each round. And then Perez is just too strong and too physical for her, in my opinion. And I think that will lead to Perez going out there and grinding this fight out by decision. All right, next up, we got Mickey Gall coming in at plus 245 in this welterweight matchup, going up against Basil Hafez, who comes in at minus 285. Now, Mickey Gall is one of those guys that I think got into the UFC a little bit too early and was fighting at a level he wasn't prepared for. Although he did win his first 3 UFC fights against Mike Jackson, which was the CM Punk sweepstakes, ended up going out there and beating CM Punk next, ended up beating Sage Northcutt after that, but then he started to run into some trouble against the tougher competition. And you say clear through line between the fighters that he was able to beat and the one he was unable to beat. He's a guy that showcases solid, I think he's a BJJ black belt, has very good submissions, improving striking game, but it's clearly not at the level that's going to allow him to be successful in the UFC. He's taken off 2 years now. I've been training over there at Killcliff FC, trying to just round out the rest of his game. But even at 32 years old now, I just don't think that this is a spot where we'll see him actually go out there and have success and try to make the changes and improvements in his game to be competitive at this level. He just got into the UFC way too early, and can you blame him? You know what I mean? If you were given an opportunity to like that, to throw yourself right in against somebody who had as much publicity as CM Punk did, of course he's going to take it. But unfortunately for him, it panned out that he just wasn't going to have as great of a UFC career after that monumental moment for him to go out there and submit CM Punk. Now, his opponent, Basil Hafez, came in on short notice last time around in his UFC debut and put on a very spirited effort against Jack Della Maddalena in a fight where he arguably could have won, ended up losing by split decision. Very close fight. It seemed like the two judges that scored it for Madalena ended up giving him the more, nod just because the damage that he was landing compared to the control time that Hafez was able to get there. Hafez, I believe, is a BJJ black belt as well. Very strong wrestling, very powerful striker as well. And I've kind of knocked on him in the past in terms of not having that great of a gas tank or an ability to manage it that well. However, he ended up shutting me up in his last regional matchup where he ended up winning the Fury FC title off of Evan Cutts, a fighter that he had lost to previously, and he was able to go out there and avenge that. But he utilized a very tepid pace striking approach where he was landing big shots, but he wasn't using too much energy or too much power, which allowed him to really just conserve his energy late on in that matchup and then eventually find that finish in the third round. But I think at his best is what we saw in the Jack Della Maddalena fight. Look for takedowns, out-muscle, out-strength his opponents, and then just smash them from that top position, control them as best as he can, look for a finish if possible, but otherwise just try to control his opponents. And I think he'll be able to do that here against Mickey Gall. Mickey Gall is a crafty submission artist as well, but I think he's going to struggle with the strength advantage that Hafez brings to the table. And even if this ends up in the striking realm, I think Hafez will be comfortable in terms of his throwing his big shots on the feet, and I think that could potentially catch Gall here and end up in a knockout spot. It's up to Hafez how he wants to play this fight. I think he could be successful from that top position if he goes for the takedowns, but in turn, he could potentially slow himself down late and allow Mickey Gall to possibly latch onto a submission. But he could also play this fight on the feet like he did in the Evan Cutts fight, landing big shots and just measuring his time, measuring his approach. And we know Mickey Gall makes mistakes in the striking realm, just as we saw when he got knocked down by, Mike Perry, Alex Morono, and even Mike Malott. I think that we'll see Hafez, take advantage and exploit similar things here. So I think Hafez wins this fight pretty much however he wants. I think he wins it inside the distance. I'm going to say club and sub or even just straight up club and drum. But I do like Hafez here, and I think he comes through as the big favorite. All right, next up, welterweights. It's actually a rematch of a fight that took place, I believe, in 2017. We got Nico Price coming in at plus 185, going through a very rough patch in his career right now, going up against Alex Morono, who comes in at minus 220. Now, these guys, like I said, initially met back in 2017, where Morono seemed to control 8 to 9 minutes of that matchup before he just got a little bit too lazy at the ending of that second round and ended up allowing Nico Price to land a big shot that completely crumpled Morono and allowed Price to end up getting his hand raised. It ultimately resulted in a no contest a couple months later, as there was a positive marijuana test on the Nico Price side of things. So very unfortunate circumstance there for Price to have that taken off of his record. But knowing Morono, he's more than accepting of that loss, and knowing that marijuana more than likely did not have an effect in that matchup. Now, Nico Price, like I mentioned, on a very tough stretch as of late. In his last 5 fights, 1-3, 1-3-1. That one no contest ended up getting changed to a no contest against Donald Cerrone. Originally a draw, like I said, but another fight where he ended up testing positive for weed, and they ended up taking that fight away from him and just giving him a no contest. His chin looking very compromised at this stage of his career, getting knocked out by Phil Rowe and Robbie Lawler back-to-back now. He's a guy that used to be very reckless in his own striking and fighting approach. His first 11 fights in the UFC ended up finishing inside the distance, whether it's him getting his hand raised or not. And then he went on a stretch of going straight to decisions, taking a little bit more of a patient approach, looking to implement his clinch and his grappling, taking opponents to the ground and trying to smash them from that top position. But it seems like he's very much struggling to get off on his own game now. His wrestling, not the greatest. He's strong, but that's pretty much it for him. And obviously he has some big power in his hands as well. His opponent this weekend, Alex Morono, has been flip-flopping between wins and losses over his last 5 fights, most recently picking up a decision victory over Court McGee in a matchup that was 1-1 going into that third round, but I know he knows the mistake that he made in the second round, which is jumping for guillotine. And he knows when he usually gets that bite on that guillotine, he doesn't jump for it unless he really feels that he had it. But he kind of overlooked the fact that he was going up against a veteran like Court McGee, who was not going to tap to something like that. And he ended up having to spend the rest of the round on his back. But then in the third round, got back to the striking success that he had, and then eventually won that fight on the scorecards. He's a fighter that's very solid, very smart. He has a high fight IQ, in my opinion, and you can hear it whenever he commentates for Fury FC as well. He's a BJJ black belt, but you don't often see him utilizing it offensively. It's more so defensively. Like I said in that the Core McGee fight, when he used it defensively there, or even I believe it was a Reese McKee fight as well. The Tim Means fight, got the guillotine choke there. That's the only time he really uses it. Otherwise, he utilizes a lot of lateral movement, crashes the pocket very well, utilizes his big strikes, throws a little bit robotically at times, it seems, but he throws with a lot of power, and it clearly gets a lot of respect from his opponents. Seeing him fight power punchers like Matthew Semelsberger and even Santiago Ponzinibbio, and having the amount of success that he had against those guys, you got to wonder, if he came into the UFC even earlier and, had things go his way a little bit better, he would have made it a little bit further in his career. Even the Ponzinibbio fight, I know he got finished in the third round of that matchup, but two judges had him up 2 rounds going into that final round. So if he had survived, however long was left in that matchup, he probably would have been victorious over a guy like Ponzinibbio, who would have been a great victory or at least a good name to have in his win column. Now, in this matchup specifically, again, the first fight, 8 minutes of Alex Morono's success, a lot of movement, a lot of big shots, hurt and dropped Nico Price a couple times as well. And I think we could see it play out similarly here. I think the confidence of Price is very much shot, and his durability is even more shot. And I think we'll see Morono capitalize on that. I think we'll see him, stick to that stick and move style, landing his big shots, getting out of range, and causing Nico Price a lot of issues here. And I think it ultimately ends up in a knockout victory for Alex Morono in the spot. If Price wants to go for takedowns, I think he will be susceptible to the aggressive jiu-jitsu style of Morono, and that will eventually cause him to tap out. But I think it's ultimately going to be a big shot on the chin that puts Nico Price out here. So give me Alex Morono, second round knockout. Next up is our third straight welterweight matchup here, as we got Phil Rowe coming in at plus 145, going up against Jake Matthews, who comes in at minus 165. We'll start off on the Phil Rowe side of things, who's coming off a very close loss to Neil Magny last time around, but he got put in to that Neil Magny type of fight and could not be victorious. Magny doing his best classic performance there, where he's able to push opponents up against the cage and really rough them up there, dirty boxing, knees, staying busy up against the fence. That's Neil Magny style. He just wears on guys and makes things very frustrating for him, for them. Phil Rowe, that ultimately snapped a 3-fight winning streak for him. As those 3 fights, he was able to knock out all of his opponents. He's really coming into his own in terms of establishing his range and touching people up from distance and landing that long range distance strikes. He usually has a very big height advantage as well as a big reach advantage, and you see him slowly getting more and more comfortable in that range, where he's able to just sit on his punches, keep his jab out there, throw his kicks up the middle as well, and just establish that range. He's working on his jiu-jitsu game, as we know as well, so he has that sneaky choke that he can get from the front headlock position as well, but I think he feels most comfortable when he's able to get that striking game going. This is a guy who was coming into the UFC that I didn't really have high hopes on, but seeing the improvements that he was making, especially during that 3-fight winning streak, leads me to believe that he could actually be quite successful. He's 33 years old right now, so there is still some quick making up to do here. He needs to really get things going right now if he wants to try to get into the title contention or even into the top 15, but given the rate that he's progressing at, it's a possibility if he can really just get his nuts and bolts together moving forward. His opponent this weekend, Jake Matthews, 29 years old. Very surprising considering how long he's been in the UFC, but he's another guy during this COVID era who's gone 500, 3-3, most recently coming off a loss to Michael Morales, a very hot upcoming prospect that he had. Pretty much got outstruck that entire fight, was unable to get off on much of his own offense. Matthews was a guy who largely relied on his grapple-heavy approach early on in his career, started developing a bit of a striking game, as we saw in the Andre Fialho fight, but I think the Matthews-Semelsberger fight brought him back down to earth in terms of being like, hey, there are still guys that are going to be better than you in the striking realm. I don't care how much experience you have, but you have to go back to your, the nitty gritty of what made you so successful and allowed you to have this longevity in the UFC for as long as he's had. But he's still not really gone to the wrestling. during this 6-fight run, he's only gone 2 of 6 on takedowns, whereas in the past, he's been landing 5, 6 takedowns in a fight, but just doesn't seem as comfortable going for that type of approach. At 29 years old, you got to believe that he could still possibly make a turnaround in his career and try to get a winning streak together and really achieve that potential that a lot of people expected from him, but it all comes down to the decisions that he makes inside the cage. Now, in this matchup against Phil Rowe, I think he's going to struggle with the 4-inch height disadvantage and the 7-inch reach disadvantage he's going to be at. And if he doesn't go for his takedowns or try to initiate the clinch as much, I think he's going to be in trouble in terms of just staying at bay and getting picked apart at range. And I think we'll see Phil Rowe really get into his groove here if he can just keep that 1-2 stuck out there, utilize that lateral movement, utilize every inch of this cage since they're going to be in a big cage as well. And I think that's going to cause Jake Matthews a lot of problems here. I'd say that this is the toughest fight on the entire card to call. So I'm ultimately going to lean with the Phil Rowe side and lean on his striking heavy approach. And I think you can see a clear line between the fighters that Jake Matthews has been beating as of late and the guys he's been losing to as of late. And I got to put Phil Rowe in the level of guys that he's been losing to. And I think that Rowe can present that issue here, especially with the striking advantage that he should have here, technically speaking. Again, Matthews can go out there and grapple him and hold him down if he wants to, but we just haven't been seeing that from him as of late, and I think we'll see enough improvements from Phil Rowe here to allow him to go out there and outstrike Jake Matthews, and I think he possibly even ends up getting a knockout victory in the spot. All right, next up, we go down to the lightweight division where we got Grant Dawson coming in at -330, going up against Joe Solecki, who comes in at +270. Now, Grant Dawson had his winning streak snapped last time around by Bobby Green, who was able to go out there and knock him out, I believe, in 37 seconds. Very unfortunate result for him, as he was a guy that was clearly on the cusp of getting into title contention, possibly being a top 5 guy, but again, very unfortunate result there. But at 30 years old, still a spot that he can potentially bounce back and still get into title contention and maybe even wear that UFC gold one day. We know what Grant Dawson brings to the table. Relentless wrestling, great cardio, good control from that top position, sneaky submissions, flashy striking game, but more so just to utilize that to eventually set up the takedowns. Great entries, great finishes, great control, solid all-around fighter. It's weird. His only 2 losses were by quick knockouts to guys that he should have beaten. Hugh Pulley and then obviously Bobby Green. They both knocked him out in 33 and 37 seconds respectively. So very unfortunate that his losses come so quickly as they do, but when he's able to really establish himself and get that wrestling going, then he's able to really control these guys and keep them on the defensive. I thought his win over Demir Ismagulov was very impressive. Ismagulov, a very high-level fighter, and Dawson pretty much muzzled him the entire night. Now his opponent this weekend, Joe Solecki, recently coming off a slam knockout loss at the hands of Drakkar Klose, a guy that a lot of people had high hopes for coming into the UFC, especially praising the level of black belt he was in terms of his jiu-jitsu. But I gotta say, I'm not that impressed with what I've been seeing when he's been on his back. Not the greatest. Obviously we saw in the Drakkar Klose fight, throws up a submission, throws up an armbar. It seemed loose anyway, and it just seemed like Drakkar Klose was going to lift him and slam him just because he could get the traction for that. But in the Jim Miller fight, if you guys watch that one back, the first round he gets taken down and does nothing off of his back. We got to credit Jim Miller for being a black belt himself and shutting that down from Solecki. But to me, it just seems like Solecki was holding on and waiting for a ref stand-up. He even did that in the Alex De Silva fight as well. I think he's much more impressive when he's able to get the back of his opponents or be the one on dominant position on top. But off of his back, I just don't think he has that much to offer here. Striking, very rudimentary as well. It's all about the takedowns and getting the back of his opponents and looking for submissions, just like he did against Carl Deaton III in his last in the last victory that he has on his record. Now, in this matchup specifically, I think Dawson is better everywhere. There's nothing that Solecki brings to this fight that gives me any issues in terms of thinking that Dawson's going to get caught in a submission. I think Dawson's too good to get caught in any type of submission from Solecki. 2, striking. Solecki has almost no striking, similar to Dawson. So as long as Dawson doesn't throw some spinning back kick and allow himself to get countered, with a hellacious punch in return, I think Dawson should be able to control the pace and how, where this fight takes place. And I think a lot of that will be with him being on top of Solecki, where Solecki will not have any answers from him, in my opinion. So I really like Dawson in the spot. I think he's worth the chalk. I think he's a guy that's going to go out there and have a smash performance here. I don't know if he finishes Joe Solecki, but I think he dominates every second of this matchup and has no issue with it either. So I think we see Dawson come back with a emphatic victory here, get himself back into that top 15 talk, top 10 talk, and get back on the road to potentially one day fighting for a title. So I'm going to take Dawson and Dawson by decision. All right, next up, we got a banger of a middleweight matchup here between Cesar Almeida, who now finds himself at a pick'em price as money has clearly come in on him over the last couple of days. He's going up against Roman Kopylov, comes in at -110 as well. Let's talk about Cesar Almeida, who has a 5-0 record, 1-0 in the UFC already, and a very impressive performance in his UFC matchup, but also his Contender Series fight. He came in to the Contender Series and the UFC strictly as a kickboxer, but it's clear he's been working on his defensive grappling game like no other. There's been kickboxers that come into the UFC and they have no ground game or no defense or anything like that. Cesar Almeida clearly been working on all of that. We saw him get taken down, or at least controlled by Dylan Budka against the cage throughout the first round of their matchup. But as soon as he got taken down, especially in open mat, he quickly worked his way, scooted his butt back to the cage, and then started utilizing the cage to get back to his feet, utilizing wrist control, underhooks, the wizard, everything. It seems like he knows exactly what he needs to do to get back to the feet, and especially how to use it to slow his opponents down, because it's going to cause a lot of energy and a lot of expenditure for his opponents to try to get him to the ground and keep him there. And then once they get back out into distance, Almeida knows what to do in terms of maintaining his range, utilizing his striking advantage, and getting his opponents out of there. The Lucas Fernando fight was a huge eye-opener for me, as I didn't think that he would be able to do that to a guy like Fernando. Not just defensively with his grappling, but offensively as well. He was able to keep Fernando in some bad spots, and then what he was able to do against Dylan Budka showcased to me that he's ready to compete against some of the better middleweights in this division. He's 36 years old, so he needs to speed things up if he wants to get to title contention, but he has a very good skill set, and seeing what his defensive grappling is like, very, very impressed. Now let's talk about Roman Kopylov, who had his, I believe, 4 or 5 fight winning streak snap last time around, where he got submitted by Anthony Hernandez. And Kopylov was going into a lot of his matchups as a big favorite because he was going out there and finishing his opponents in the second and third rounds. He had a very solid striking advantage over a lot of those guys, and he was able to stop the takedowns coming his way and then eventually get them out of there. But he was unable to do that against Hernandez. Excuse me. We know what Hernandez was going to do. He's going to utilized a lot of movement, a lot of action, a lot of activity, and then eventually open up those takedown opportunities where he was going to be able to take Kopylov to the ground and eventually find that submission the way that he did. Kopylov, in my opinion, has had a cardio issue, but he has been benefiting from fighting against guys that had cardio issues of their own or durability issues of their own, where he was able to put a couple punches together, a nice high kick, whatever it was, and get those guys out of there. But with Cesar Almeida, I think he's going to be in for some shit. I think Almeida, even if Kopylov looks to go out there and try to take a grapple-heavy approach, which I don't think he will do, but even if he chooses to do, will not work out in his favor. I don't think he'll be able to get to a position that he can eventually get a submission or a TKO finish. I think we'll see Almeida continuously make him work and try to, keep him down. He'll obviously keep working back to his feet, and that's only going to expend the energy from Kopylov even quicker, and that will allow Almeida to start breaking out into distance a little bit easier and utilizing his striking advantage there, and really hurting Kopylov and eventually getting him out of there as well. If they strike, I think Almeida has the advantage there. It could be a little bit competitive early, but as Almeida starts to establish his striking style and get into the groove and throwing his combinations, it's going to cause Kopylov a lot of issues. So it does not surprise me at all to see the line move as much as it has, and it wouldn't surprise me if Almeida ends up closing as the slight favorite in this matchup. But I do like Almeida here, and I do like him to go out there and get that knockout. All right, I think that takes us to our main card now, where we got welterweights kicking off the card here. Where we got Randy Brown coming in at -160, going up against Elizio Zaleski, who comes in at +140. This is a striker's delight between two strikers that utilize a different approach to get off on their game. We'll start off on the Randy Brown side, who's on a 2-fight winning streak, most recently going out there and knocking out Muslim Salikov in the first round of their matchup. Randy Brown, at 33 years old now, is really starting to come into his own in terms of establishing his range, staying behind that jab, and utilizing his crazy 6'3", 78-inch frame for this welterweight division. it causes a lot of opponents issues, other than guys like Jack Della Maddalena, who just know of the perfect techniques and approaches and game plans in terms of how to get in on that against Randy Brown, continuously keeping him on his back foot, and then eventually finding that club and sub the way that he did. But Randy Brown, still very technical, very solid, has fought power punchers in the past and still come out on top. The Chaos Williams, Francisco Trinaldo, Muslim Salikov. So he's shown that he's becoming way more disciplined, way more difficult to hit, and then kind of just cruises at his range and just waits for that knockout to come, or just chip away at his opponents and beat them on the scorecards. Now, his opponent this weekend, Oleksiejczuk Zaleski, is coming off a draw to Rinat Fakhretdinov in a fight that I believe that he lost the first 2 rounds, but then eventually got that 10-8 in the 3rd round to end up getting that draw on 2 judges' scorecards. Before that, he was able to go out there and defeat Benoit Saint-Denis in one of the most lopsided beatdowns we've ever seen, which was Benoit Saint-Denis' UFC debut. And then go out there and beat up Abubakar Nurmagomedov to end up getting his hand raised there. Now, the issue with Zaleski, who's 37 years old now, has been his inactivity inside the cage. Just throwing it out there, this is he is picking it up now. This will be his 3rd fight in the span of 12 months for the first time in 2019. So those last couple of years, I think he didn't even fight in 2022, I believe it was. There was one of those years where he just didn't fight, but just not that active, really not getting into the cage much, which has kind of stunted his growth inside the UFC. He's had some good wins, Benoit Saint-Denis, Alexei Kunchenko, even Abubakar Nurmagomedov, but has never really been able to get into a groove here or get onto a solid winning streak. Capoeira style, likes those flashy kicks, has some decent power, has a good jiu-jitsu game as well, but I think he's going to struggle with the size advantage and the speed advantage that Randy Brown will hold in this matchup. I think we'll see Randy Brown maintain that range, utilize his footwork, utilize that jab down the middle, and keep Zaleski at bay. Zaleski could have some success with potentially utilizing some of that unorthodox movement that comes with the capoeira striking style, but I still believe that Randy Brown will be more than ready for that. Keep his footwork about him, utilize every inch of that big cage in the UFC, that they use at these big pay-per-view events, and that will allow Randy Brown to just be successful doing what he does best, keeping these, hard hitters at bay. And I think he'll be able to do that here against a 37-year-old Zaleski. So give me Brown, and Brown by decision. All right, heavyweights going at it here, where we got Jailton Almeida coming in at minus 255, going up against Alexander Romanov, who comes in at plus 215. Now, we'll start off on the Almeida side, who had his hype train derailed last time around against Curtis Blades. And even though he won that first round by controlling Blades up against the cage, landing a few takedowns, I think he was 9 of 11 on takedowns in that first round, he was unable to establish a dominant enough position to try to work for a finish or try to get Blades out of there. Then in the second round, he got back to the same thing, but he left his head in a place that Curtis Blades was able to let go on hammer fist, and that ultimately knocked down and knocked out Jailton Almeida, ultimately stopping that hype train or that run that he was on. Normally, Almeida goes out there and just smashes opponents on the mat and gets them out of there quickly. So his last 2 performances were very unlike him, but I think that also has to do with the level of opponents that he was facing. Right? Goes up against Derek Lewis, takes him down, controls him for 21 out of 25 minutes that they're fighting, but unable to produce a finish. Very weird circumstance there. And then obviously the Curtis Blades fight again. Major success in the first round, but not enough to get Blades out of there. And then Blades finds the perfect recipe to end up getting the finish himself. So Almeida, 32 years old, still young for the heavyweight division, if you want to put some perspective in that. And I think he's still capable of eventually finding himself in a title fight, depending on the route that he ends up taking to the top once again. His opponent, Alexander Romanov, snapped a 2-fight losing streak last time around by actually defeating somebody by decision, something that not a lot of people expected him to do, considering the poor gas tank issues we've seen from him in the past. But last time around, he utilized the threat of the takedown to use his volume striking style to defeat Blagoy Ivanov. He used his grappling in the second round, controlled Ivanov on the mat, but then in the third round got back to his striking and swept Ivanov on all 3 scorecards. Very impressive. That was not something I was expecting Romanov to do, but it seems like he's starting to get a little bit more comfortable in the striking realm, trying to just manage his gas tank a little bit better. In this matchup, Almeida, he'll be at he has the bigger metrics in terms of, 6'3", 79-inch reach. So he's 1 inch taller as well as a 4-inch longer reach, but obviously the bigger, bulkier fighter here will be Romanov. So it's going to be interesting to see how Almeida looks to try to take out Romanov to the ground, who comes from I believe, a wrestling background of his own. So it might be competitive early, but if Almeida pushes that pace of wearing on Romanov and engaging in grappling and clinching and just trying to set the pace, I think we'll see Romanov's cardio issues come back and haunt him here. So I do think that we'll see Almeida eventually complete the takedown and then start to smash Romanov from that top position. I'm thinking that we're going to see Jailton maybe round 2 TKO or submission. I think it's going to be a little bit competitive early as they start jockeying for position. Romanov may even have a little bit of success there, but I think he's going to struggle to keep down a guy like Almeida, and I think Almeida will eventually showcase that he has a better gas tank, and he should be able to get this fight to the ground and then get back to what he does best here. So I do like Almeida inside the distance. Another loss for King Kong, Alexander Romanov. All right, moving over to the middleweight division here, we got Kevin Holland coming in at minus 260, going up against Michal Oleksiejczuk, who comes in at plus 220. Now, we'll start off on the Kevin Holland side of things here, who's coming off of 2 straight losses at the hands of Jack Della Maddalena and Michael Page. 2 fights where he was unable to get his striking style going, and even the Michael Page fight, he thought he'd be able to strike with him, and we ultimately found out quickly that he was not going to be able to do so. At 31 years old, he's accrued in a tremendous amount of experience against very high-level competition, and I think that's going to aid him against guys that are looking to break into the top 15. When Holland is at his best, he's able to go out there and utilize his length and his range with his striking and that 81-inch reach to keep opponents at bay, snipe them from the distance, and eventually get them out of there. He also has a sneaky submission game that he can implement against opponents that may look for desperation takedowns or just slack a little bit too much in grappling situations. But we know that his fight IQ has been a little bit of an issue in the past. Doesn't have a very good wrestling game, but he does have a very good jiu-jitsu game. So it's all about kind of building that bridge in terms of if he is fighting a better striker, how he's going to get his jiu-jitsu game going, and if he can do that. And this weekend might be an example of a fight where he might have to lean on his grappling a little bit to deal with the thrashing style of Michal Oleksiejczuk. Now, last time around, Oleksiejczuk came up short against Michel Pereira in a fight where he tried to pressure Pereira, but he was dealing with a guy that was way more powerful, way more faster, and way more explosive. And we saw Pereira pretty much hurt him right off the bat, hurt him to the body, and then eventually open up that submission opportunity to get him out of there. I believe, that was maybe less than a minute, if I remember correctly. But I've always been a fan of Oleksiejczuk, 29 years old still, and showcases a very pressure-heavy game. This guy walks forward, digs to the body very hard, looking to crumple his opponents, and we saw him even do that successfully, I believe, against Khalil Roundtree back in his UFC debut. I think that was back in 2019. Keeps on the pressure, stays on keeps his foot on the gas, and just tries to overwhelm and break in his opponents. I think he's going to struggle to do that here against Kevin Holland, though, as Holland should be able to utilize his footwork well enough, utilize the stingier shots down the pipe, hurting Oleksiejczuk a couple times. I think he could potentially even get a club and sub spot here. But at minus 260, Kevin Holland's a tough guy to trust at that price tag, especially going up against a guy that can really push the pace and command the pace like Michal Oleksiejczuk. So I don't hate any shot that anybody's taking on Oleksiejczuk here, but I think that Holland, if he fights smartly and does really try to implement that range and that footwork, he can really bust up Oleksiejczuk here and possibly get a club and sub spot for him here. So I'm going to go Holland and Holland inside the distance. All right, moving over to the co-main event. Reminder, it is 5 rounds in the middleweight division. We got Sean Strickland coming in at minus 240 going up against Paulo Costa, who comes in at plus 205. Now, let's start off on the Strickland side of things, who pulled off one of the biggest upsets that we've seen in a championship fight back in September, where he dethroned Israel Adesanya, hurting him numerous times, but ultimately winning that fight on the scorecards. He showcased that his pressure style was very tough for some guys, but then he ended up losing his title in January to Dricus du Plessis in a very close fight, but it ultimately ended up being the damage-based style of du Plessis that ended up getting his hand raised there. Sorry, du Plessis. I know I'm going to have some people come at me for pronouncing his name wrong. Strickland's style has been effective against most opponents. He, similar to Michal Oleksiejczuk, just likes to stay in his opponent's face, roll with a lot of shots, throw combinations in return, stick on the volume, throw up that front kick to the belly every so often, but just keep that a lot of head movement, a lot of just moving around while staying in his opponent's face, and then coming back with a barrage of shots of his own. He has a great gas tank as well, so he's able to go a hard 25 if he needs to, but a lot of his success depends on him going out there and really just overwhelming his opponents and breaking them, just like he did against Nasruddin Imavov, just like he did against Abis Magomedov, just like he did against Israel Adesanya. But the guys that he seems to have trouble with are guys that are able to kind of just stand in that pocket with him, but throw in heavier shots and throw, fight-ending shots. We saw Alex Pereira do it. We saw Jared Cannonier land some big shots. And say what you want about that decision, the power and the impact in which Cannonier was landing with was probably more beneficial to the judges compared to whatever the pitter-patter shots that Sean Strickland was throwing. And then Dricus du Plessis probably came down to some of the power shots that du Plessis was landing compared to the volume that Strickland was landing. So there is that little margin there, which is kind of surprising to me why the line is currently at minus 240. Because Paulo Costa, we know, if anything, this guy likes to throw with some power. And excuse me, things haven't been going great for him lately, right? He's 2-3 over his last 5 fights. But I think what he showed in his last matchup against Robert Whittaker, and the fact that he's coming back pretty quickly after that, is that he's kind of back in the game, right? He's physically all there. When he fights, he's really trying to fight. Hurt Whittaker very badly at the ending of the first round, but was unable to deal with that, karate in and out blitzing style that Whittaker was bringing to the table. But it was obvious that Costa really wanted to fight. He really wanted to get off on his offense and try to find the knockout there. So the fact that he's training, he's actually there. He's not just taking time off. He's not looking to take a 205-pound catch weight again, just like he did against Marvin Vettori before his Luke Rockhold fight. But I think the most important part is the fact that he's getting right back into action so quickly after the fight that he had with Robert Whittaker. That's the most impressive part here, which makes me believe that he's probably very tuned in, or is very locked in, at least trying to have some success at this stage of his career. So in terms of how these guys match up with one another, volume versus power, and I have to lean ever so slightly to the Paulo Costa side at plus 205, considering he could land some big shots here that could potentially even put out Sean Strickland. You're talking about having 5 rounds of potentially landing that big shot to potentially put him out, but also getting the damage on Strickland, landing those big shots, cutting him up a little bit. That will sway the judges potentially in his favor if this fight does end up seeing the scorecards. Again, Strickland might be able to break him. Strickland might be able to walk him down and slow Costa down. But Costa, even in his worst shape, just as you saw in the Marvin Vettori fight, he can still go out there and lay it on the line. I believe he won the 5th round on all 3 judges' scorecards in that Vettori fight, even though he wasn't taking that fight that seriously at all. So at plus 205, getting a guy of Paulo Costa's level and the stylistic class that he has here against Sean Strickland, and I've been a big Sean Strickland guy in the past. I've gone out there and paid big chalk on him in the past and was more than happy with it. But it's obvious, as we're seeing in throughout his last several fights, power punchers are potentially his biggest issue, and guys that can actually sway the judges in their favor rather than the volume that Strickland continuously lands at. So I'm going to take Costa here. I'm going to take Costa by knockout as well, but even just taking the money line here at plus 205, not a bad spot. All right, main event time, lightweight title on the line. We got the streaking Islam Makhachev, I believe hasn't lost a fight in 9 years. He's coming off of 2 straight title defenses over Alexander Volkanovski. He was supposed to rematch Charles Oliveira back in October, but Oliveira pulled out. Volkanovski steps in, ends up finishing him and shutting that chapter down. He's going up against Dustin Poirier, who comes in at plus 405, minus 555 is the current line on the champion. No need to really go into this one too much. Obviously, we got to go with Makhachev. We know what he's all about, wrestling. Big pressure from that top position, good jiu-jitsu game as well, improving striking game too. But I think for him to face the least resistance against any of his opponents is to take fights to the ground and just smash his opponents from that top position, open up that back take, and eventually sink in the choke. His opponent, Dustin Poirier, flip-flopping wins and losses over his last couple of fights, most recently knocking out streaking contender Benoit Saint-Denis after losing that first round, getting out grappled in that fight, or at least in that first round, and then Saint-Denis just his cardio falling off a cliff. And then Poirier was able to take advantage of the striking advantage that he had in that matchup. The fight before that ended up getting knocked out by Justin Gaethje. But we see the trend with Poirier. When he's fighting guys that have a grapple-heavy approach, that have a good enough gas tank to put that pressure on him and eventually break him and submit him, he's going to get submitted, right? Charles Oliveira and Khabib were the main guys that were able to do that to him. And Islam Makhachev is cut of the same cloth of those guys. And I think he'll be able to do the same thing here against Poirier. So I'll be kind of leaning into that Makhachev submission prop if we can get plus money on it at least. I think Makhachev is a shoo-in to win this fight easily. I think he's just taking it, it was kind of put together on short notice, and I think it was more so Makhachev just wanting to fight here. It's after Ramadan. He can finally get back into action. If he fights now in June, he'll have more than enough time to prepare for that October Abu Dhabi card, which he always finds himself fighting at anyway. So, I think he was more than happy to take this Dustin Poirier fight so that he can get through it quickly and then eventually fight, I'm assuming, Arman Tsarukyan in October. But this matchup, look for Makhachev, maybe test it out on the feet a little bit, but it's just going to be a matter of time before he eventually gets this fight to the ground, and then from there eventually breaks Poirier and gets him to give up his back and sink in that rear naked choke. Give me Makhachev by submission, and still. All right, there you guys go. It feels nice to be back in the pocket here, breaking down fights for you guys. We got 4 straight weekends of events for the UFC, capping off with a big UFC 303 Conor McGregor return fight at the ending of June, and then there's another week off to kick off July. A ton of regional events going down this week as well, this whole month. And lastly, on, I think maybe likely Sunday, I'll be dropping an Ultimate Fighter 32 primer / breakdown / preview as the new season of the Ultimate Fighter kicks off on Tuesday. I'm familiar with a lot of the guys that have been signed to the show, so I just wanted to give you guys a quick primer, and if you guys are interested in watching the Ultimate Fighter, you guys can check out that video, see what to expect from a lot of these guys. I may even give a prediction who I think is going to win the entire show for both divisions, so if that interests you, look for that on Sunday as the new season kicks off on the following Tuesday. Not this Tuesday, but the next Tuesday. And then obviously throughout fight week, we got a bunch of other great content coming for you guys this week. Tuesday, top 3 lock of the night candidates. Wednesday, top 3 dog of the night candidates. Thursday, quick picks. Friday, Locky 2-step / Locky Trinity free parlay and the 3 best prop bets as well. And then Saturday night after the fights finish, I'll be dropping my recap video, immediate reaction for every single matchup. So if you guys are down with that, make sure you guys check it out. I just want to keep talking because it's been so long since I've done a solid podcast with you guys. So I appreciate all the love and support. Make sure you guys hit that like and subscribe if you haven't already. Otherwise, I will see you guys tomorrow for the top 3 lock of the night candidates. Peace.